Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting and involved citizen in Mississauga to introduce you tonight. Grant Clark is his name. He's been on the Mississauga Board of Trade. He's been on the Mississauga Arts Council. He's been involved in lots of other civil activities, political activities within Mississauga over the years. And he's also an HR, human relations expert. He recruits for some of the biggest and most well-known companies in Canada, and consults on human relations issues. And so he knows, I think, a lot about people and what makes people tick. Grant Clark, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
My pleasure to have you back. Let's start out with why you got involved in community stuff. Well, you've been a successful business person. You've got a successful career. It obviously kept you busy. Why would you also want to get involved in community stuff? And what was that community stuff that you got involved in?
I think to me, it's very important, Brian. I've lived in Mississauga since 1959. I've attended school here, met my wife here. We were married in the late 60s, and we've raised 3 children here. So the community is very important to our family and certainly to me. As you mentioned, I've been involved in a number of different community activities, including the Mississauga Board of Trade, where I was on the board for several years and chair. The Mississauga Arts Council with yourself. I've also been involved for almost a decade with Peel Dufferin Mental Health because I have a very strong interest in mental health issues, which are important in any community. And I guess my reason for speaking today is, as you know, we're in the middle of a mayoralty campaign, and you're one of the candidates. In looking at the slate of candidates, in my opinion, you would be the best one suited to be our next mayor. I think you've had a long involvement with the community in a number of different ways. You feel you're very well educated. You've worked in a number of different communities, and you have a passion for the city itself and its citizens. So to me, you're the only one of the candidates running this year that I would consider voting for.
Well, that's very kind of you, Grant. I really appreciate that. What do you think makes a good mayor? You've worked for mayors in the past. You've interacted with a lot of them. What makes a good mayor, sir?
I think a good mayor is someone that cares about their community, ideally very passionately. Has a history of living in the community, participating in activities that influence the community, and have a vision for what the city can be in the future, and not rely on things that we've done in the past or things that might seem usual. I think you're that kind of person. And if I look at the roster of others running, I don't see that same level of expertise and passion there.
I've really questioned whether career politicians can lead a $5 billion enterprise with 5,000 employees. Particularly if it's got to go through some change, some pretty significant change, looking for efficiencies and effectiveness, where tax increases are 2 to 3 times inflation. But they seem to think that because they know how council works, they're the best able to continue what they've been doing. I worry that sort of just continues the status quo. What's your sense of a career politician versus a business person in politics?
I think, well, again, my own background has been in business. For the majority of my career, I've been involved in community organizations, as you mentioned, so I have some understanding of communities. But what I think we need is somebody who can look at the situation from a business perspective and understand what things are important to ensure that the needs of the citizens of the city are met, and the city is seen as an attractive place for people to live, work, and do business. And those are the things that I think are most important, rather than have they been on council in the past and have they represented a small group of individuals in that area.
You've been very involved in the Board of Trade. As you mentioned, you were chair of the Board of Trade a few times for a few years. What are the big issues for business in Mississauga, do you think?
I think the big issues are being able to ensure that we have a competent and professional workforce access to that, and one that encourages more people that want to come and live in our community and work here. To me, that's most important.
You've been involved in the Arts Council. What do you think? Is the arts and culture important to a community, or is it just sort of one of those nice to dos?
No, I think it's very important. If I look back at the Arts Council, and you and I were both involved at the same time for a period of time, and I look at the past history and what it's accomplished and what it's done in the last few years. You and I were both involved in the recruiting of the current head of the Arts Council, Mike Douglas. And if I look at what Mike and the Arts Council itself have accomplished in the last few years compared to the prior term, it's substantial. And I think I have people in my own family. One of my daughters is a writer. My wife has as a graduate in honors English and has a long-term interest in writing. There's a very strong interest in our family in arts.
You know, one of the things that I have been disappointed by is that we don't seem to have had some of the infrastructure investments that are visionary in the last, several years. And I've, shown the Living Arts Center as one example that Hazel McCallion, the former mayor of Mississauga, really was the spearhead behind getting the money from both volunteer donations as well as from city and provincial coffers to build and fund the Living Arts Center, which is really a beautiful facility in downtown, Mississauga, if you can call that, in the Square One area. The Hershey Center, now the Paramount Center, maybe a little bit overbuilt, maybe in the wrong place, but a substantial piece of municipal infrastructure. Celebration Square and City Hall. And I think Celebration Square has become a place where people can meet and gather and experience culture together. We haven't built anything of late. And I think that's a real negative to the current city council and the past city council. What do you think? Am I wrong in that regard?
No, I think you're right. I think the city needs to continue to pay attention to areas like that. That help really create and sustain the culture of a community. And I don't think there's enough attention being paid to that currently, and I think there should be more in the future.
What could we do? Any suggestions on the things that we should be doing?
Not particularly, no, not specifically.
So I've been a big proponent of One Port Street. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's 18 acres of land, 150,000 square foot warehouse building that is, right there down in Port Credit, sticking out into the water.
Yes, very familiar with it.
Everywhere else in the world, I would have thought they would have turned it into a waterfront attraction. And right now our city council and the federal government that owns it, Canada Lands, are thinking about turning it into 10 more condominiums. And it's interesting. There was an article in the Globe and Mail Saturday that criticized Toronto and that it squandered an opportunity to knit the waterfront together. And it sounds to me almost like, you could apply that same article to Mississauga, that we're not doing the things that we could and should be doing. 18 different cities in North America right now are looking at or are developing waterfront retail entertainment. And I think that, that 150,000 square foot building, if it was in Vancouver, would be Granville Island Market. If it was in Chicago, it'd be Navy Pier. If it was in New York, it'd be South Street Seaport. It would be a Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. And we're allowing it to store boats and geese. I just think it's
a travesty. It could be an
incredible attraction for arts and culture.
I think you raise a very good point, and I've often wondered, when my wife and I walk down on the waterfront frequently, at least once a week, and looking at that space in contrast to the development that's going on west of there, it's very puzzling. It's a very attractive spot right in the center of the community on the waterfront, and it seems to have been abandoned. It has been
abandoned.
Yeah. No,
Let me ask you another question. The airport corporate zone, so that's the whole area from the airport out to Pill Hill along Highway 401. And it's partly in Rexdale, it's partly in Mississauga, it's partly in Brampton. is the second largest employment zone in all of Canada. And the Neptis Foundation, about a decade ago, did a study that said that when you've got two employment zones in one city, you have to connect them by transit because otherwise it's two separate ecosystems rather than one ecosystem. And they used the example of La Défense and the Champs-Élysées, the City of London and Canary Wharf, Manhattan and New Jersey and Brooklyn, et cetera, and said that the lack of a connective, transit route or something like that between the airport corporate zone and downtown Toronto meant that it was a completely separate area, and said that we weren't doing the things that we could and should do to really advocate for it, incubate it, support it, promote it, et cetera. And that was squandering a huge opportunity, because if it was in Montreal or if it was in Kitchener-Waterloo, if it was in Vancouver, we'd have a super cluster, we'd have an incubator, we'd have more support. We'd integrate it more with the post-secondary institutions that are around. Are we doing, do you think, the things we need to do to support business in Mississauga?
I think we could be more effective, perhaps, in what we're doing. And in the areas you mentioned, I'm very familiar with the airport. I worked for a decade for Cara Operations, which had significant facilities at the airport. So I've watched the development and evolution of that over the years. But I think there's definitely, let's say, a new need for a different approach on what we're doing with our commercialization in the city.
Last question. You're an HR expert. You've recruited for and run HR for some of Canada's most successful companies. If instead of an election, we were actually recruiting for the CEO, because that's what the mayor is, the CEO of a several billion-dollar enterprise with 5,000 employees, what would be the criteria you would use, sir, in your recruiting process?
I guess the criteria I would use is I'd be looking for someone with knowledge and experience of the community itself, but I would also be looking for someone who has, let's say, a fairly deep understanding of business and who has worked in industry, perhaps as well as government, as opposed to someone who has primarily been a career politician. I think we need the former skills a lot more than the latter. And I look at the current slate of people running besides yourself, and I don't see the depth here. I see people that have, been career politicians in Mississauga, some of them for varying periods of time, but I don't see any breadth of experience and understanding of business and what kind of impact that can have on our community.
I agree with you. I think it's a real issue. Actually, let me ask you one last question, if I could, because you're a business person and you've also been very involved in the community, as we've talked about. There's a difficult concept that I've been trying to get across, and I don't know how to do it. And it's the tax increases. Let me explain this to you, if I could. So the city council, the former mayor and the city council and the councillors that are currently running for mayor have described this year's tax increase as a quote unquote modest 2.3% tax increase. But the way they get the 2.3% number is they take the Mississauga tax increase and they divide it by the Mississauga taxes and the Peel taxes and say that's a 2.3% increase. But then they say the Peel taxes have gone up by 4.5%. And they do that by taking the Peel tax increase and dividing it by the Mississauga taxes and the Peel taxes. And then they take the 2.3 and the 4.5 and they add it together and say the total tax increase is over 7%. But it's because they're actually dividing by a denominator that's twice as big. Because if they took Mississauga taxes divided by Mississauga tax increase divided by Mississauga taxes, it would actually be 6.3%. And if you took Peel taxes by Peel tax increase by Peel taxes, it would be 8.4%. And the average is that same over 7%. No one in business, no one in any other political environment would be dividing by a denominator that's twice as big, and I think misrepresenting what the tax increase is. And anyone can look at their own property tax bill and know it didn't go up by a modest 2.3%. It went up by, over 7%, twice inflation. I think it's misrepresentation, but I can't seem to get any of the media to pay attention, any of the councillors to admit that they're misrepresenting the truth. And I worry that they don't understand it and they're fooling themselves and thinking they're being modest when in fact they're at 2 times inflation. Am I wrong? What am I doing wrong?
No, I think that the fact that they're not being candid about it and then saying what the total increase really is, they're trying to make it look smaller, obviously, which I don't find that's disingenuous to me to behave that way and express things. I mean, one of the things I look for most in someone who I would vote for in any particular position is, do I understand what they're talking about? Is what they're saying makes sense? And is what they're going to do have a positive effect on my life and my, community?
Grant Clark, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
All the best, sir.
Okay.
We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.